Hello, and welcome to episode 43 of Charlotte Mecklenburg History with Dan Morrill. Today is Sunday, February 21st, 2021, and I am Dan's daughter, Mary Dana. I'm here with Dan through Zoom, and I'm very excited. Today, we also have a guest with us, Andre Kearns. Thank you, Andre, for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
Of course, and my dad is going to introduce you and before you guys get started. So go ahead, Dad.
Well, Andre, thank you so much. Andre, folks, has a very interesting connection to the history of Mecklenburg County, a very, very special perspective, which he can explain far better than I can. And I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail because I want to basically have him be able to tell what he's doing and why he's doing it and the impact of it. And I just want to sort of have a very free-flowing conversation. So I'm going to start out with a question. I know that Andre has done a tremendous amount of work and committed a lot of intellectual energy to doing genealogical research into his family. And Andre, I want to ask you two questions in relation to that. First of all, was this a matter of intellectual curiosity? Many people who are genealogists simply get great fulfillment from knowing what their ancestry was. Or are there certain broader issues? Are there certain broader reasons that you have committed the amount of time to your family research? And talk about that and also how you're connected to Mecklenburg County history.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me just say thanks, Dan, for the opportunity to join you. And also thank you for your lifetime of work documenting and preserving the history of Mecklenburg County. I've come across it as I've done my family history research, and it's been extraordinarily valuable and helpful for me. So thank you for that. Happy to be here. A little bit about myself, Andre Kearns. I'm actually a native of Washington, D.C. So I live here with my wife and two sons. And I have a passion for genealogy and family history. So my mom was born in Virginia. My dad was born in Raleigh. But my dad's family is originally from Charlotte. And so I've been researching my family tree and our family history for about 15 years now. And I've traced our Kearns ancestry back to my ancestors who were born enslaved in the early 1800s, who labored on the Torrance Plantation in Long Creek Township in current day Huntersville, and then also the Kearns plantation. The Torrances and the Kearns were neighbors. And so I've traced my ancestors back to both of those places. And so that is my connection in Mecklenburg County to Huntersville, to Charlotte. And so to your question around my reasons for pursuing genealogy and my family history, yes, absolutely. I feel drawn as from an intellectual curiosity perspective. I've always been enjoyed history. I've always been a student of history. So there's definitely that. I enjoy a good puzzle. So I'm an analytical person. And, the fun thing about genealogy and family history is every time you answer one question, it raises two more questions, right? So every time you identify an ancestor, the next natural questions are, well, who were their parents, right? And so it's a fun puzzle to research, identify data points without perfect information, but really using a critical mind to kind of cobble together and connect the dots to really discover and uncover really interesting history. So there's definitely intellectual component to what motivates me to spend so much time on family history. But you also asked about the broader reason, and there's definitely a broader reason there. and I can't really explain why, but I just have always felt this intense drive to uncover and tell the stories of my ancestors, particularly my enslaved ancestors, and their contributions to Mecklenburg County and to this country. You know, our stories, our history are part of American history, part of the American history canon, and they should be known. And so when I uncover that history on my family, on my enslaved ancestors, I want to share that so that it's known. I've uncovered a lot, and a lot of times my first reaction when I uncover things is a feeling of anger and sadness, particularly as it pertains to the history of slavery and how my ancestors were really suffered under it. But and it's really difficult to see people treated as property in documents, just looking at documents, right? A lot of my research is around researching wills, probate records, deeds, because these are records that document transactions of enslaved persons. So seeing your ancestors being willed to other people, bought and sold to other people, seeing dollar values being placed on them. I've uncovered so much of this in my own research. I've even found a document selling one of my ancestors for $1, right? It's all very difficult to see. But once I'm kind of over the shock and the emotion of seeing these things, my anger and sadness turns to inspiration. I'm really inspired by the stories of my ancestors' struggles and what they went through, and really their application of agency over their circumstance to be free and to make sure that the next generation advances, and so that I could be here. My perspective is that my enslaved ancestors built this country. They built Mecklenburg County. We talk about founding fathers, my ancestors are the founding fathers and mothers of this country, just as anyone else. My great-great-grandfather, James Augustus Kearns, who's known as Gus, his photo hangs in my house. He was born enslaved in Long Creek Township, which is now Huntersville, around 1861. And slavery orphaned him. He never knew the name of his mother or his father. We know a little bit from his family history. The family oral history was that his father was a white man and his mother was an enslaved woman, enslaved on the Kearns plantation. And that's about all that was passed down. And that's all that we think that he knew about his own background. And so as I started researching him, his marriage certificate and his death record, they leave the names of his parents blank. So it's really humbling for me to do this research and to think that now 160 years after his birth, that as his great-great-grandson, I am able to know what he was never able to know in his lifetime, and that's the name of his parents, which were William and Caroline, by the way. And so I've been able to do this through research and through the power of DNA testing and things like that. And so, I think what that helps me to kind of realize and uncover is that, folks like my great-great-grandfather, Gus, he's a founding father of Mecklenburg County, right? His ancestors labored for Mecklenburg County men who are recognized as Revolutionary War patriots. He was a bricklayer. So I can imagine him really helping to build many of the historical structures of Mecklenburg County as you drive around. Which specific structures he helped to build, we may never know, but I'm sure that he was a contributor to them. I found a 1903 deed for Miranda Presbyterian Church, which is in Long Creek. It's in the Miranda is in the Sunset Road neighborhood, for those familiar with Mecklenburg County. But he was a trustee of Miranda Presbyterian Church, and this is a church that was founded in 1869 by formerly enslaved people who were figuring out how to establish lives as free people for themselves. A few years post emancipation. So, he was a founder of our family. He and my great-great-grandmother, Augusta Johnson, had 10 children, including my great-grandfather, Andre Kearns. And again, his struggles, the agency that he exerted over his life, his vision for living as a free man really laid the foundation for me to be here talking with you today. And so I'm just really, really grateful for that. And I'd also say that my research it's difficult work researching enslaved people, enslaved families, but I've been really blessed. I've been motivated and driven to share my research as blogs, as presentations, and that has given me a bit of a public profile, right? And it's enabled me to connect with people who are also researching Mecklenburg County, and historians such as yourself. I've connected with a really talented group of amazing Mecklenburg County focused researchers, Jeffrey Kaiser Parody, John Blythe, Amanda Hunter, Michelle Johnson, Elizabeth Torrance, and many other people. And they've really helped me to put the puzzle pieces together of my own family history. I bring some pieces to the table, they bring some pieces to the table, and you kind of are able to piece it together and you get a complete picture. In fact, Amanda actually introduced the two of us, Dan. So, but I would just say that type of collaboration really is key to unlocking the complete history of Mecklenburg County, and people who have ancestors from there, who descend from there. And so this experience connecting with these amazing researchers really enriched my life.
Well, you talked about, when we were talking briefly before we started this, about the historical narrative. I think so many people don't understand that, they think history is the past. And I tell them, if they think that, they've missed the whole boat. History is a human creation. It's a human creation of memory and imagination, research. But the underlying narrative that exists in a culture or exists in a society, it's one of those things, in my judgment, that is so important that most people don't even know it is important.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about, there is now in North Carolina, interestingly, there's quite a little controversy going on about changing the standards of social studies teaching in the public schools.
Mm-hmm.
There are events in North Carolina history, some of which are very, very painful, and perhaps the most dramatic of them was a huge, really almost lynching event in Wilmington in 1898.
Oh my goodness!
It was a big, massive movement against the Black population. I went to the public schools of North Carolina, obviously eons ago, but I never heard anything about that.
Right.
In fact, I remember a very interesting incident when I was probably in about the 4th, 5th grade. We were reading a story in a book, and of course, when I was born in 1937, so I never went to school with a single Black person.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a totally segregated, and there was a story where one of the students had developed a very meaningful relationship with the janitor at her school. Well, of course, all the janitors at our school were Black.
Mhm.
And I remember the teacher explained to us, now you have to understand that not all janitors are Black. In other words, to give a sort of different context. So we all form our worldview when we're children
Mhm.
by this sort of historical narrative. Now, there's this idea that we ought to broaden, make diverse, include greater. How do you feel about the need to do that, the importance to do that? What do you think will be the benefits of doing that?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful framing of it. I do think that we need to think more broadly on our history. But I think I feel lucky growing up in the family that I did, in the time that I did. My parents really raised me to be anchored in the history of African Americans and the contributions of African Americans, the contributions of our enslaved ancestors to this country. And even beyond that, right, feeling a connection to history as African descended people prior to enslavement. So history in Africa, rich history of Africans prior to our history as African descended people in America. And so, and I remember like they had my parents had a library, lots of books on history. I think that's what sparked my interest in history to a large degree. And I would spend a lot of time in our family library reading those history books and, my mom and dad's books, just to broaden my perspective. And so that did give me a more complete, I feel, perspective on our history as a country. It helped, what I was learning at home helped to augment what I may or may not have been getting at school, in history class, in social studies class, to your point. And then my education continued in college. I attended Morehouse College, which is a historically Black college. And our most famous graduate is Martin Luther King Jr., right? And he is, one of his famous quotes is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," right? And so I feel like that is a frame for understanding our historical narratives. The founding fathers outlined this vision for establishing a more perfect union within the Constitution. And so they do frame this vision, but they fail to realize it for all people. And I think the history of African Americans in this country is multifaceted and it's rich. But one key tenet of it is it's the history of people struggling, protesting, often giving their lives for this country so that it will live up to that vision of a more perfect union for all people. And so I feel blessed that I've grown up the way that I did to be able to have that perspective on our history. I do think that the predominant historical narrative that you're referencing, and sparking this debate in around social studies curriculum, history curriculum, it's heavily anchored in the Revolutionary War in 1776 and in our founding fathers, right? And so essentially it's a narrative of great men, more specifically great white men who have led this country to freedom, right? And so across this narrative, I believe, that we get in school, the contributions of many Americans, everyday Americans, particularly enslaved people, can be rendered somewhat invisible, right? And so that's, I think, the struggle and our opportunity to be better here. So here's an example that I was thinking about as I was kind of preparing to talk with you. So as I said, I'm a student of American history. I really enjoy visiting historical sites in my spare time. So in 2019, I visited Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, for the first time. and I really enjoyed it. But my experience also was a reminder of how we frame this predominant historical narrative. So we know, Washington as an accomplished soldier, as our first president. I learned a lot more about him touring Mount Vernon, right? And so our tour guide did a good job framing all of these things that George Washington accomplished as a farmer and as a businessman at Mount Vernon. And so a lot of that was new to me and new to the other folks in the tour group that I was a part of. But I remember someone in my tour group commenting, how in the world did George Washington accomplish all that he did as a farmer and landowner across this expanse of land with everything else that's going on? And the reality is because he was a slave owner, right? So he was relying on slave labor to accomplish a lot of what he did at Mount Vernon. Enslaved people, indentured people ran that plantation. And so the fact that this was so invisible to that person in my tour group, I think is representative of our challenge and opportunity, right? And even if I think about the way that Mount Vernon is laid out, the slave cabins are positioned in the back of the property. It's behind landscaping, and it's essentially renders the slave cabins invisible to people who are visiting Mount Vernon, and they're pulling up, driving up through the lawn to the front of Mount Vernon. You can't see any of that. And I think that was by design, right? And so I think it's a physical analogy to our challenge and opportunity around this historical narrative. And then the other thing that I was just reflecting on is that the other facet of the predominant historical narrative that I'd point out is a lot of people, it's hard for them to acknowledge that our founders were fallible people, right? So here's another example from my trip to Mount Vernon. So according to our tour guide, George Washington was revered by the soldiers that he led, and that makes complete sense, and that's certainly consistent with everything that I've learned in school, right? But he was also reviled by those who labored on the Mount Vernon plantation. So indentured servants who worked on the plantation left literally the moment that their contracts were up. And then there's the stories of how George Washington treated the hundreds of people whom he enslaved. So he was obsessed, for example, I remember this story, he was obsessed with maintaining this immaculate lawn, which visitors, that's the first thing they saw when they pulled up to Mount Vernon. And so he made it a rule that no one was to step on this lawn, this immaculate lawn. Well, one day, a single footprint was discovered by him on the lawn. And so George Washington had that footprint cast, and they evidently found an enslaved man whose foot generally fit the imprint. I don't know whether that's because he had the same size foot as whoever was stepped on the lawn or what. But anyway, they found him and they accused him of stepping on the lawn, and they whipped him severely, right? And so I shared this. I mean, this story was kind of seared in my brain because it goes against what you know about George Washington. And I shared the story on Facebook as part of kind of sharing my experience in Mount Vernon. And I just remember, like, some people really had a hard time believing that that story was true, that it could be true, that it was real. They had an emotional reaction to having to kind of sharing any negative story about George Washington, and to the point where they didn't believe that it would be possible. And this is even though the history was shared by a tour guide who is a historian who studied Washington her whole life and had worked for Mount Vernon for years. So, I think that those are some examples that come to mind when I think about kind of the historical narrative and our opportunity moving forward.
Mary Dana, how are we doing on time? What time?
Oh, hold on one second. About 25 minutes.
Well, let me tell you,
I'm the timekeeper, Andre.
one deal. Here's my viewpoint, and I'll give you an example. One deals with slavery and the existence of slavery. One is touching a third rail. It evokes strong feelings, understandably strong feelings. And Mary Dana can attest to this. One of the things that, one of the podcasts that I did was to simply make people aware of the fact, as I mentioned to you, that slavery, was a very, very large, widespread institution in Mecklenburg County. And that contrary to the belief of many, we still have several examples of imposing plantation houses, former plantation houses, in Mecklenburg County.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, except with one exception, all the slave buildings are gone, but the houses are still there. So I put out a sort of a promo for my podcast saying that I was going to give people to know where these plantation houses were. Well, one white man who is, I mean, it's almost like lighting a fuse, you know, whenever you bring up a subject that has anything to do, and he's a white man, anything to do with Civil War, slavery, it's just, you might as well just strike the match.
Right. It's called gaslighting. Yep.
He accused me because I was going to give this tour of being a white supremacist.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
you know,
I remember.
I mean, you know, of course, my reaction was good grief, you know, all I'm doing is showing these artifacts, you know, that's all I'm doing. I'm not putting a spin on them. I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying it's terrible. And one of those was Cedar Grove, the Torrance plantation. Well, that really illustrates the fact that, and then there are other people, they don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to touch it. And a lot of them don't want to touch it because they just find it so upsetting, so unsettling, not only from those who understandably, from an African American perspective, have some of that initial anger that you were talking about, but it also, a lot of white people would say, oh my God, look, why don't you just forget about all this? This is, you know, this is dead and gone and eliminated. And what do we even do? What are you bringing all this up for?
Well, it makes me think about what Andre was saying about how they just wanted to hide the slave quarters at Mount Vernon.
Well,
they just want to say, oh, let's just forget about that and hide it behind some landscaping.
And I want to transition to Cedar Grove. And by the way, I think it's wonderful that you're going to be talking to Abigail Jennings. Abigail is terrific. She is terrific. You know, that photograph I sent you, that one of the back, and I thought that young Black female in rather traditional garb at the rear of the house was just incredible.
And it was incredible to me because I saw the photo, and the photo was dramatic enough. And then when you emailed back and said, did you see the figure in it? I hadn't. So I went back and looked at it, and that just made it much more incredible. And your mind starts racing, thinking, who was this person?
That's right.
And with my family history, wondering who is this person in relation to my own family's history.
Exactly.
So it's powerful.
Exactly. Well, I had some people tell me on Facebook. You know what Facebook is. Facebook, it opens up the door to everything
Right.
and everybody. Who said that I was foolish to show that photograph because the Black Lives Matter people would come and the cancel culture people are going to come and they're going to burn it down.
Mm.
And my response was, well, why would anybody want to destroy an artifact? I mean, it's an artifact.
Mm-hmm.
You can interpret the artifact whatever you bring to it, but it's an artifact. It's a teaching. They said, well, the same kind of people like the city council of Fayetteville, North Carolina, wants to get rid of the market where they sold slaves to die. Well, talk to me about that kind of reaction. I mean, does that surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it in our world of social media and politically charged discussions, I think being able to have thoughtful exchanges on our history has become more difficult. I do think that there's a there's a difference between history and kind of honorifics of a slave past, right? So I think insisting that we represent our historical figures and their totality with their flaws within full historical context, that's history. That should not be canceled. But I would also say that some things that people say are history are really honorifics to, say, the Confederacy or slavery. So, for example, taxpayer-funded Confederate statues in a public square, to me, they're not history. And, you and I talked about that when we first connected. You have honorifics to men who fought against the U.S. to maintain slavery. And these monuments were erected not to capture history for people to learn, but really to intimidate Black populations in Southern places during Jim Crow, right? And so I feel like insisting on statues coming down like that, that's not an example of cancel culture to me. But dismissing our history and historical figures in their totality, their talents and their flaws, because they had flaws, that is cancel culture, right? Like to try to throw away all that Lincoln did because of some of his perspectives and his shortcomings related to kind of understanding the potential of African Americans as full citizens in this country, to say, oh, because he said this, let's throw that away, let's cancel him. That, to me, that's cancel culture that I'm not fully comfortable with. But I do think that we can achieve this more holistic view of our history. And I'll give you another example of a recent experience that I think is headed in the right direction. My family and I decided to spend the 4th of July in Charlottesville. So my son's a high school senior. So we went to visit the campus of University of Virginia. And then we also visited Monticello. So that's the plantation of Thomas Jefferson. And that was my first time visiting Monticello. And I just feel like they're moving in the right direction in terms of working to represent the totality of Jefferson's legacy as a man and not as a mythical founder without fault, right? So, I mean, I feel like Monticello fully embraces Jefferson's legacy as a slave owner explicitly in the narrative that they represent to visitors. And so, when we visited Monticello, we took in a very insightful presentation on slavery at Monticello. I was really impressed. The presenter spoke the names of many of those that Jefferson enslaved, people like Jupiter Evans, and talked about all of Jupiter Evans's contributions to Jefferson and what he did and how it allowed Jefferson to do what he did and spend his time on. Monticello features dwellings for enslaved families, right, that you can tour. It features prominently the story of Sally Hemings, a woman who was enslaved to Thomas Jefferson, and also a woman who was the mother of 6 of his children. It features an African-American graveyard, which contains multiple unmarked graves of those who were enslaved on the plantation, right? And so Monticello is doing, I think, a good job representing the whole view of history. It's not something they've been doing all along. I think it's been a 20 or 30-year journey for them to get to this point. But I do think that that's an example of how kind of more holistic representation of our history can be achieved. And I feel like that's a model for something like Cedar Grove, right? In preserving Cedar Grove. The goal would not be to preserve it as an honorific to James G. Torrance, who, my connection to James G. Torrance is that he owned my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Charlotte. But the goal would be, as you said, to really preserve these artifacts, preserve this as a snapshot of our shared history, preserve it as a really unique picture of life in Mecklenburg County at that time. And so that means representing the Torrances for who they were. And it means really digging deep, to me, to uncover and represent the contributions of the people enslaved at Cedar Grove, right? So for example, I think I read one of your articles that talk about how Cedar Grove was constructed from 12,000 bricks. So enslaved people created those bricks and they built those structures. And so how do you represent that story into what you're preserving as history for Cedar Grove? And it's, it takes conviction. It's really hard work unearthing those stories. They are there to be uncovered. You just have to dig a little deeper and harder to find them. And I also say that I'm really amazed by the Torrance papers archived at UNCC. So thank you for your work ensuring that has happened. It's an amazing, amazing resource. I've kind of experienced it digitally online. When COVID is over, I look forward to actually going to UNCC and seeing the full files and archives myself and flipping through them. But I think one of the more amazing documents is this 1840 inventory of the 100+ people enslaved on the Torrance plantation. It is, in 15 years of researching, it's one of the most detailed accounts of people enslaved on a plantation that I have ever come across. And it lists names, it enlists ages, it groups enslaved persons. And from those groupings, you can infer family groupings and family relationships. It's really remarkable. And so when I think about the creativity that you're talking about and how we can apply creativity to preserving our history, one of the things I think about that I'd love to start is, maybe there's a project like the Georgetown 272 for the Torrance notebook associated with Cedar Grove. Call it the Torrance 100, right? And so let's get a project together to start researching the family trees for all of the enslaved people listed in that book and connecting with the descendants so that we can start to stitch together that history and be able to represent it as part of Cedar Grove. So I'm energized about that. And then I'm also energized about preserving the historical sites and places of the formerly enslaved. So I mentioned Miranda earlier, right? What can we do to represent and preserve the history of Miranda? It was originally part of the Carr plantation. It's where my ancestors established a church, a one-room schoolhouse where my ancestors were educated, all this, post-emancipation. So in addition to all that's possible in kind of preserving Cedar Grove, I am personally interested in also finding a way to preserve those sites that have that, that history around post-emancipation and how people started to establish their lives as free people.
Mary Dana, how are we on time?
40 minutes.
Well, we're going to end up this, but I'm going to put you in touch with two people. One is a man named Anthony Roberts, who heads the public history program at UNCC. For God's sake, you and he ought to talk about this, because they've got graduate students at that institution. And I think it would be a terrific activity. Also, I'm going to put you in contact with a man named Jürgen Buchenau, who's as German as anybody can be. He's very sensitive to the issues that you're talking about. And he's the chair of the history department. And I'm going to send you their email addresses. And I'm going to email both of them. And I'm going to say that Abigail wants to do the right thing. Abigail is somebody that's got a broad perspective. So I'm going to end it, but let's keep in contact. You have been so gracious in giving your perspectives. I am so appreciative for what you're doing. Thank you for your kind words to me, and let's keep in touch.
Absolutely. I look forward to that. I look forward to the introductions, and thank you both.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for your time, Andre.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye,
Yeah.
everyone.
Bye.